Hi, everybody. We're going to get started on social psychology next. Actually, social psych is going to get busted into two units. We're going to do one in this 2 week segment and one in the next 2 week segment. And then I'm not sure we're going to go after this. Some of this stuff gets a little difficult compared to what we would be doing in class. As a matter of fact, this would probably be the day that we would be doing the atom bomb shelter experiment, but that really won't work very well like this. Maybe I'll try and figure out a way to do it. But we're going to start looking at social psychology today, and the idea that this plays a role in. Now, if you're watching this first, that's probably great, because there's only two assignments to this segment of things. There's the guide that goes along with this, and then there's the short article about social psychology as a whole. All right, let's get going. So first of all, social psych encompasses a lot of ideas because it's basically how do people get along with each other in society. And some of the things that we're going to look at in this particular segment are going to be the ideas of race, culture, and ethnic group. We're going to talk about conformity, reference grouping, and a little bit about deviance and deviant behavior. So it's going to seem like it jumps around a little bit, and that's because social psychology is such a large area of study. And so the first thing we're going to look at, let's turn that off, that was annoying, is the idea of diversity in the United States. And diversity is a really interesting word. I come from a very small town, actually smaller than Marshall. We didn't even have a stoplight. And growing up, our town was 100% white, 100% English speaking. And the first minority person that I ever really got to know was in high school. And so I didn't come from a very diverse background. And then my high school only had 2 African-American students, no Latino students, no Asian students, of 665 kids. When I got to Whitewater, that was when I really met a lot of people from a lot of different cultures. But when I was a kid growing up, one of the things that I was taught was the idea that America was a melting pot. That it's this place where all these great cultures come together and they share. My cat's climbing up the back of my chair. They share these ideas, and that together makes one great culture. I would contest, and most social psychologists would contest, that America isn't really a melting pot. It's more of a mosaic. And the reason that they would say that, if you don't know what a mosaic is, it's a picture that is made by a lot of separate pieces being put together, but the pieces don't truly mix or melt together. They're these separate pieces that come together. For instance, if you were to go to any major American city, it's pretty common to find still to this day ethnic neighborhoods, Chinatowns, Greek towns, Little Italies, and things like that, and to find pockets of the city where certain languages are spoke more than others. Even in Madison, there's areas of town that different racial groups or different ethnic groups tend to live in more so than others. And to look at this, if you look at the history of the United States over like the last 120 or so years, in 1900, 9 out of 10 people that lived in the United States were white, Anglo-Saxon, European background. Jump ahead 90 years, and that number hadn't changed that much. It was 7 out of 10. And in the 20 years after that, it became approximately 67% white, or 2/3. Now that number has changed. We have a census going on right now. That number is believed to be big time on the change. And I've read different studies that claim that by, I think it's 2050 or 2040, the United States may actually be less than 50% Caucasian. Nothing wrong with that. But when you look at the idea of cultural diversity in the United States and Canada and Europe, you're going to notice that a lot of those countries are white, Caucasian dominant. And the reason why that's a big deal is those are the countries that mainly study psychology. And so it's fair to say that psychology is a fairly white or Caucasian science. Now, the change in those numbers over time has happened because of immigration from different places in the world. And actually, studies have shown that the largest percentages of immigrants coming into the United States are actually coming from Asian countries. And so that's why we're seeing the percentages drop a little bit more drastically lately. Now, some terms we want to get you guys familiar with so you understand what's going on are 3 terms that a lot of people use interchangeably. Sorry if that annoying screencastify thing's in the way on the bottom. But they're very different words. People use them interchangeably, but they're very different. And the first one's culture. When I was a kid, we got told culture was the way you live your life. And I think that that's probably a fairly accurate short definition. But for our purposes, we're going to say that it's a set of beliefs, attitudes, and values that are held in common by a large number of people and passed down from generation to generation. This one gets a little tricky in the United States because I guess the question that I would ask is there truly an American culture? Think about that for a second. Is there one culture that we can say is truly that this is America right here? Personally, I don't necessarily think there is. I think maybe there's a Midwestern culture. Maybe there's maybe families have their own culture, but I think it's really hard to pinpoint an American culture. We're kind of a hodgepodge of a lot of different things. But that idea of this is the way you live your life. This is the way that a group of people would live their life, and the ideas they pass down from generation to generation. The idea of, turkey on this holiday, ham on this holiday, we give gifts here, there are fireworks there. That is obviously different than a lot of places in the world, but do we strictly have one culture in the United States? The second idea that sometimes gets mixed in with culture is race. And race is a set of hereditary physical characteristics. Obviously, when we talk about race, people focus on skin color because it's the most obvious, quickest to view characteristic of race, where there are things like the shape of people's eyes, height, different things that you're born with that create these different racial things. There are a lot of different races out there. And obviously, this is something that has shaped history, psychology, and life for a very long time. And last but not least is the idea of ethnic group. An ethnic group are people that are from the same country or area that have similar race and culture. We know a lot about ethnic groups. We talk a lot about ethnicity. We talk a lot about ethnic groups, and we talk about food. All right. For instance, if you're going to get tacos, you're not going and getting a race's food. You're not even going to get a culture's food. You're going to get a food from an ethnic group because a taco doesn't necessarily look the same in different parts of the world where tacos are prevalent. The same way that you take something simple like, I've had this long-standing debate about the idea of chili. Okay, the food chili, not the country, the food chili. Where I'm from, chili does not have noodles in it. One of the first times I ever got invited to a student's house for dinner, they were having chili, and I was like, oh, cool, I love chili. And I got there and it had noodles in it, and it had celery in it. I thought that was really weird. But when I asked the family where they got their recipe, they said their family was from Eastern European country, and that was very common in Eastern European ethnicities. And so I need you to understand that these three words often get used interchangeably, but they're very, very different. Now, psychology does not have a great track record with diversity. And the reason for that is it's mainly studied in those white countries, white middle-class countries that are in the United States, that are in Europe, and obviously Canada. And so early on in the science of psychology, we made a lot of guesses about people in other parts of the world. They actually believed that people that live in the southern hemisphere were called antipodes. And that early on, they believed their organs were actually flipped upside down in their body because gravity was different in the southern hemisphere. Now, if they believed that about people, think about all the misconceptions they made about behavior. The track record, again, of psychology is not great. In the 1800s, they really set out to try to prove that white people were better than everybody else. And originally, the way that they did this is someone did a study where they measured the circumference of people's heads, claiming that people that had larger heads had larger brains and were therefore smarter. And they claimed to measure people's heads in the United States and Europe, Africa and Asia, and South America. And surprise, surprise, the heads of people in the United States, Canada, and Europe were like 3 inches larger than everyone else around the world. And this got published, and people, believed that here's our number one piece of proof that white people are smarter. The reality was no heads were measured. All of the information was falsified, but we didn't find out about this until 35 years after the study. Then in the 1920s, a psychologist claimed that white people were just capable of being more intelligent. Our mental intellect was better. Our IQs were higher. And they set out to prove this by giving IQ tests to people around the world. Now, unlike the first set of tests, they actually did test people, but there was one glitch. Sure, the white people, the Americans and the Europeans and the Canadians, they tested higher than everybody else. But the test was only given in English. They tested no African American people. They tested no black people in Europe, no Latino people in America or Europe. They only tested people, African people in Africa. They only tested Latino people in South America, and they only tested Asian people in Asia, and the test was given only in English. Think about that. How would people in other parts of the world do on a test that was only given in English? Finally, in the 1940s and mainly in the 1960s, psychologists decided this wasn't how they wanted to go about doing things. They didn't need to prove racial inferiority or racial superiority. They wanted to learn about how people thought. Now, the next topic in this chapter is about group influences, or the importance of groups to us and how they shape our behavior. And so the groups you belong to obviously influence your life experience. The fact that you were a small town Wisconsin kid has shaped who you are, and what you see. If you look at major businesses around the world, they have a pretty big impact on what their employees do, where, think, things like that. If you go to work for Microsoft and you're an executive, you're going to wear a suit and tie every day. You're going to have an office. You're going to have a secretary. But if you work at Google, things are a little looser. You might be able to hold a meeting at a picnic table. You might be able to go into the bouncy house room or the ballroom. Look at schools. All right, look at the groups that you belong to and how they impact the way you dress, the way you act, the things you do, who you do and don't sit with, and the expectations that you have and are placed on you. Your family is even a group that you belong to that helps place expectations on you. Obviously, the more important that a group is, the more likely we are to associate with that group, and our feelings are going to be stronger. We tend to internalize their ideas. I used to have a student that worked at Target and really loved that she worked at Target. And so she basically talked nonstop about how great Target was and how it was so much better than other places, and about how employees were treated better and customers were better and the goods were better. And we even noticed that she started to wear red even more, even on days when she didn't work. She was really internalizing those beliefs. I really like my classes and really like psychology or American history, you might start to internalize some of the things that we do in my classroom and make them part of the way that you approach other classes or the way that you approach life. The key thing to this, though, is to remember that the idea, and this is covered on the bottom line, conformity, sometimes people hear the word conformity and they think that's bad. I don't want to be like everybody else. But if we associate with a group and it's a good group, and obviously that's a little tricky, good group, bad group, conformity isn't always evil. All right. The influences that I've had because of groups that I belong to have obviously had positive and negative impacts on my behavior. We refer to these groups that we belong to as reference groups. Now, that's a group with which one identifies, and they help to provide a standard of behavior. If you think about it, if you're a member of the football team, for instance, there are certain things that football players do that maybe other people in the school don't do. They wear jerseys on Friday. They know that they have to do weightlifting in the summer. They all know what the term, if you say to the corner, football players know that means that they're about to run what we call a pit. But they're also in on certain jokes that other people might not be in on. They get to see Mr. Kleinheinz, myself, and some of you guys know Mr. Schneider. Most of you guys know Mr. Schneider in different ways than other people do. But they provide those standards of behavior. Whereas if you're a member of a church group, the standards of behavior are different there. Or if you were to work at a Target or a grocery store, you'll have different standards of behavior. The standards of behavior, my family, are different than the ones that you might have at your house. They might be stricter, they might be looser. Here are an example of some work groups that some of you guys might belong to. Reference groups some of you guys might belong to. And you probably literally belong to dozens of reference groups. Obviously, they provide a way for us to see the world. I think about it. I about 17 years ago went on a Spanish class trip and saw Europe. I might not have been able to do that trip or see those things or go to those places had I not been a teacher at Marshall High School. A lot of students go on color experience trips, or the softball team goes to Disney to play softball over spring break every couple of years. Those provide us with opportunities, the same way that being members of certain families or working at certain places allow us to see the world through different eyes than somebody else might see them. Obviously, there's a big difference in that in the world. In the 1920s, a psychologist set out to see if reference groups impacted the way that kids grew up. And they started off with something called a stereoscope. A stereoscope is like a ViewMaster. You guys had ViewMasters when you were little. You looked at them, you clicked, and different 3D pictures popped up. The idea of a stereoscope was you look through a right lens and a left lens, and we're shown two different pictures. The two pictures were of a baseball player and a bullfighter. They asked kids in the United States when they held the stereoscope up what they saw. And they said, inevitably, they saw a baseball player playing baseball. Kids in European countries and in Mexico said that they saw a bullfighter. When asked what the other picture was, oftentimes they couldn't identify what it was that they were looking at. Obviously, we will fit our attitudes to groups that we belong to, whether we understand the group or not. It helps us associate with other people. It helps us form our attitudes. A lot of times, I jumped ahead too fast. People will change their values to fit in with a new reference group. Some of you guys are going to be going away to college next year or within the next couple of years. Some of you guys will be the only person from your high school that goes to that college. And so you're going to make a completely new set of friends. You may change your values. You may change the ideas of what's important to you. You may start listening to different music. You may watch different shows. You may start to have different social behaviors or study habits because of the new reference groups you'll form. And then you'll get done with school or go on into the job force, and maybe you'll move to a different state and your reference group may change again. And you're going to keep changing your values and your core ideas. I'm not saying that your core values, the things that make you are going to change, but maybe the things that you're interested in and do for fun may change. One really interesting experiment that was done on this, and there's a Netflix documentary about this someplace. It's called the Prisoner Guard Experiment, and it deals with reference grouping. It was done at Stanford University in the 1970s by a world famous psychologist named Philip Zimbardo. And what Zimbardo did was he set up a fake prison. He had 24 volunteers picked from a pool of students. And he then broke them into two groups. 12 of them would be randomly assigned as guards. I say random because they actually put the most aggressive people as the guards. And 12 would be assigned as prisoners. They'd be given training for their roles, and they'd be given like the job or the clothes for the roles too. They actually took in a dormitory and changed it into a prison with real cells and the whole thing. When the experiment started, they actually had the 12 prisoners arrested. They were searched, they were fingerprinted, they were given a mattress and prison-style clothing. The guards got to go home. They worked shifts, they had billy clubs, they did the whole thing. The experiment was supposed to last for 60 days. It only lasted 6 because people assumed their roles so strongly. When the prisoners didn't obey, the guards got brutal. They would lock them up, they would beat them. And actually what ended the experiment, according to a lot of studies, is it was found during a cell search that one of the prisoners had started to sharpen the back end of his toothbrush to turn it into a shiv to stab one of the guards. To this day, Stanford University pays for therapy for some of the people involved in this study. Even though it was only 6 days long, they developed post-traumatic stress disorder. Zimbardo classified the experiment as a success, though, because it showed the importance of reference grouping and how fast we can buy into a group. Now, how we view others is oftentimes based on some really simple ideas. And I'm going to go through this slide pretty quickly because I think it's something that we all understand. We base our actions on things like prejudice, discrimination, stereotypes, and preconceived notions. Now, by definition, a stereotype is a fixed set of beliefs about a group of people that may or may not be accurate. We make them identical of everybody in the same group. People tend to favor people that are like them and not look as highly upon people that aren't. For instance, without being offensive, football players, a stereotype about football players is that they're not very smart. Blondes are not as bright. Cheerleaders are all peppy. Librarians all wear glasses. Things like that. I'm not going down any of the negative stereotype roads where we can have some problems here. Obviously, stereotypes play a purpose. They help us make sense of the world for starters, but they also solidify the power group. The group that's in charge, the stereotypes about them are generally positive, and therefore they break down the weak. And they ward off the idea that the minority group could take over because it helps to keep them down. Stereotypes obviously can be positive and negative. We would assume that if we met a doctor, that person must be smart, they must be responsible, they must be the kind of person that you can depend on. But stereotypes can also be negative. We've all heard of groups of people referred to as lazy. We've all heard of groups of people that are more likely to have certain problems than others. But again, they keep the weak weak and they keep the strong strong. And we tend to pay less attention to the negatives of people that are like us. They've actually found that in interview situations, the people that are running the interviews tend to describe people that are similar to them in more positive attributes, even if the interviewees answer the questions the exact same way. Obviously, titles or job titles can have stereotypes that go along with them. If you think about things like my dad, my dad, when I was growing up, my dad worked in furniture delivery. But after my dad got done with that job, he became a garbage man. Now think about your stereotypes about garbage men. But while my dad was a garbage man, he was also a fire chief and a school board president. Now think about your stereotypes about a fire chief and your stereotypes about school board presidents. Job titles have certain expectations that come along with them. We expect the sheriff to be law abiding. We expect a race car driver to be a good driver. All right. We expect a teacher to know things about their topic areas. And so students learn. We have these expectations with what these things mean. Now, stereotypes exist, and whether they're good or bad, they're out there. But when we get into these next two terms, that's when we have problems: prejudice and discriminations. Stereotypes are really hard to avoid because we're trying to identify things that we don't understand, and so we see them as the average in the group. The problem comes in when we have prejudice. Now, I like to think about it this way. Prejudice is an idea that's usually negative. Discrimination is a behavior, is an action. And so when a stereotype is negative, it can cause prejudice or bad thoughts about someone. A prejudice is generally a judgment of somebody that's based on the group as a whole rather than their individual characteristics for the negative. Discrimination is when we mistreat or we deny someone rights based on the group that they belong in. All right, so again, prejudice is an idea, discrimination is an action. There's some interesting things that happen, though, along with these. Is we have something called illusory correlations. That is when we have a stereotype or a prejudice that we believe so strongly in that we ignore messages that don't agree with our stereotypes. We only see the things we want to see, only see the things that make our stereotypes or our prejudice stronger. So that's an illusory correlation. We see things that match our already held beliefs. So let's say you think women are bad drivers. Terrible stereotype, not true. Actually, the insurance numbers say exactly the opposite. If you think women are bad drivers and you see a woman who is an excellent driver, you're in the car with a woman who is following all the traffic rules, she applies her turn signals, she stays at the posted speed limit, you never at any point feel unsafe in the car with that person. You tend to ignore that. Now, if you see one woman pulled over or one woman who is in a car accident, you're going to go, yep, there it is. Females are bad drivers. So we look to pick out things that match our stereotypes and prejudices. It could have the ability to change our perception about something, but we tend to ignore it. Now, overcoming prejudice. How do we get rid of this? And basically the ideas of overcoming prejudice are that On individual basis is when you get to know somebody, it breaks down stereotypes. People start to see people and go, well, that person's not like that because they're my target employee. That's my cheerleader. These are my football players. This is my kid who used to go to Waterloo, and therefore he's a Marshall kid now. He's smarter and better. We found that immersing ourselves in another culture or another system helps as well. It helps us eliminate negative beliefs. When we provide helping behavior or someone provides helping behavior for us or cooperation in projects, that can also help break down prejudice and discrimination. Speaking up on a personal level. Something else that goes along with prejudice and this is the idea of scapegoating. Wow, this is an annoying thing. And that's obviously when things go wrong, we look for someone to blame. We tend to look for people that are not in our group, people that have stereotypes that we have a prejudice against, and maybe even someone that we discriminate against. If you think about this, prejudice is kind of built into the process. And obviously, there's a lot of historical examples of this, like, for instance, the Holocaust. Hitler blamed the Jews for the loss of World War I, and therefore he scapegoated them. And think about this. At your level, is there anybody that you scapegoat when things go wrong? I know when I was a kid growing up, I scapegoated my little sister, and I would blame her for things that went wrong at my house. Now, changing attitudes on stereotypes and prejudice obviously can be difficult. And one of the things that we deal with in this is the idea of cognitive dissonance. This is where the illusory correlation happens too many times. We start to see too many good female drivers. And so we have to start to deal with our own garbage. We have to start to deal with the fact that maybe our stereotype is not accurate. And so where an illusory correlation is, we ignore the things that don't fit. In a cognitive dissonance, we realize we have to pay attention to them. We realize that these people are smart. These people are good. These people aren't lazy. These people aren't bad drivers. They are capable students. And so we have to deal with it. All right. One of the things, though, that can happen with changing an attitude is we do tend to yield to others in a group and conform. And one of the more famous experiments done on this was done by a guy named Stanley Milgram. Now, Milgram was Jewish, and after World War II, he wanted to know why the Nazis did the things they did to Jewish people. He wanted to know, were they truly all evil, or were they following Hitler's orders and doing what it is that they were supposed to do? And so he set up an experiment, and here's the diagram, where Milgram himself was the experimenter. You would be the teacher. The student was actually an actor. And what you had is, from the teacher to the student, there was an electrical cord. I'm air quoting electrical cord because there was no electricity. Milgram would tell you, as the main person in the experiment, that it was your job to read questions to the student. If the student got it wrong, you pushed a button, which caused a low-level shock to happen to the student. Every time the student got a question wrong, the shock became more extreme until it could cause physical harm. You would start to ask questions. The student would start getting things wrong, and you would have to administer shocks. In the beginning, the student would be like, "Ow, that hurts a little." And then it would start to progressively get worse and worse until they would start to beg for help or for you to stop. Now, take in mind, the student wasn't actually being shocked again. They were an actor. No big deal. Nothing was really happening. But the teacher started to hesitate. Milgram, as the experimenter, said, "I'm in charge. You agreed that you were going to do this. Please keep shocking them." They actually had the student simulate falling on the ground. They had the student simulate passing out because they were behind a separate wall, and they would cry and ask for help, and then they would stop responding altogether. And actually, in like 80% of the cases, the teacher continued to shock the student beyond their calls for help or even passing out. And Milgram believed that we have a tendency to comply to authority. Now, last but not least in this unit is the idea of deviants. People that don't fit into what society does, or people that don't go along with reference groups and compromise the goals of the group. All right, so they don't follow things called mores and folkways, which are just generally like the generally accepted rules of society. Dry throat, I've been talking too long. The problem is, though, what we tend to do in society is we drive out deviants. And when we drive deviates out of groups, they tend to flock together and then form their own separate, what's called a counterculture. Some people would say these are cults. Some people would just say that they're different groups of people. Sometimes deviates have rose up and become the dominant power. Now, this is where I'm going to call this chapter here. Might seem like a little bit of a hodgepodge of stuff, and it kind of is. When we hit the next chapter, I'm going to pull some of these ideas together. You'll find that a lot of this unit was about vocabulary, and that's what most of the questions I'm asking you about it are. Hope you understood everything okay. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I am literally sitting and waiting to hear from you guys. I will talk to you soon.